So in the last chapter, we were talking with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model about we could have a shock to a sector of the economy, and that was enough to cause a shift to the long-run aggregate supply curve, real shock, or to the aggregate demand curve, which would be an aggregate demand shock. This chapter is saying that a shock in one area of the economy could be transmitted to another area of the economy and or amplified. And so what they're wanting to do in this chapter is to just list and explain a little bit more about 5 transmission amplification mechanisms. So the first one we're going to talk about is intertemporal substitution. All right, so it's going to involve time in some way, right? Intertemporal substitution. It is the allocation of our consumption, our work, our leisure across time to maximize well-being. In other words, we're trying to figure out, does it make sense to work really hard right now or not? And so the way this works is if things are good, if the economy is humming along, things are being really productive, it actually makes sense to work more and work harder than when things are bad. For example, when you have a class and you know a test is coming up, and you know it's in 14 days, do you divide up everything you need to do for getting ready for the test into 1/14th's worth of work, and each day you do a little bit of studying and a little bit of studying, a little bit of studying, and then you get to the 14th day and you take the test? Well, most people would say no, the night before or maybe a few days before, but basically when you get close to the test, that's when you really put in the time to study. That's an example of intertemporal substitution. It makes sense as you get closer to the test to put in the extra work to really make sure you have the information down. So for the economy, during a boom, people are less likely to retire. They are more likely to come out of retirement. You're just going to see this increase in work during a boom time, which is going to amplify the boom. That's kind of what we're trying to say in this chapter. And then we are going to work less when times are bad. We're more likely to retire early, go back to school, those sorts of things. In a rural economy that's still more agricultural, you'll see this where if you have really good weather, the farmers will go out there and work extra hours to try to get as much as they can from their big crop. But if things have already gone wrong and your crop is basically worthless, it doesn't make sense to keep working really hard. So that is basically intertemporal substitution. The book does show a graph on intertemporal substitution showing how the employment population ratio varies with the trend in GDP. And so that's the idea that when GDP is really high, you start to see more people coming out. The employment rises compared to population. And when GDP is lower, you tend to see a lower employment. So there is some indication in the data that intertemporal substitution does occur, and its overall impact on the economy is to amplify the shock. So if you have a negative real shock that's decreasing long run aggregate supply curve, then this intertemporal substitution will increase the decrease. In other words, it'll shift it further to the left. All right, so that's the first one. The second one is uncertainty and irreversible investments. All right, so often in economics, we just assume we know everything and there's no uncertainty. But the real world, you're not sure what will happen. And so what this specifically is looking at, this point is looking at, is the thing that, the type of investments you make that are irreversible. In other words, you're going to make the investment and you cannot get it back, right? The investment will only have value under specific conditions, and you can't move it, you can't dismantle it, you can't use the investment in some other way if it turns out not to be useful, because that's what we're saying. This is an investment that cannot be reversed. So for example, if you're building a skyscraper, you need to believe that this skyscraper's space will be something you can lease out and it'll be used. Once you've built it, you can't get back all the cement and steel and everything that went into it. It's irreversibly there. So you want to be sure before you invest in something that is irreversible that it's going to be a good investment. So the more you're uncertain, the more you're going to react. Well, I guess I should say the more concern you have about the future of the economy, the less likely you want to take the risk of making an irreversible investment. So if the investment is irreversible and you find yourself more concerned about the future of the economy, you will see investments go down by more because people are pulling back on these. So again, this is a thing where I'm going to do a negative shock. If you had a negative shock to the economy, it's going to amplify this negative shock if the uncertainty is there about investments. So that is uncertainty and irreversible investments. So we can go on to our third one here, and this one is called labor adjustment costs. All right, labor adjustment costs. So let's say a worker loses his job because of some negative shock that has happened to the economy. He has to decide what he wants to do next. Does he kind of wait around a little bit because he thinks the job's going to come back, like it's a cyclical unemployment sort of thing? In the time that he's waiting, maybe he should start a new business, just to have something else going on in his life. Or maybe he should even move to another location. Maybe other parts of the country have better opportunities. So these are choices he needs to make, but once you've made one of these choices, they're somewhat costly to reverse. If you move and then the job comes back where you were, it's going to cost a lot to move and then move back, right? If you start a business, it might be difficult and expensive to give it up when the job comes back. So labor adjustment costs is defined as the costs of shifting workers from the declining sectors of the economy to the growing sectors. So for some reason you've lost your job, obviously your sector is declining at the moment. It would make sense in a rational sense to quickly move you over somewhere else where that's doing better at this time, but there's this adjustment cost that you're not ready to make that change. You're not ready to make that permanent investment and take yourself out. So because it takes time to make adjustments, and during that time the workers are actually unemployed or underemployed, that means that the negative shock that started this whole thing is being amplified. So we're going to do another time one, and this one is called time bunching, and it's easy to confuse it with intertemporal substitution. I think the way to distinguish time bunching is defined as the tendency for economic activities to be coordinated at common points in time. The tendency for economic activities to be coordinated at common points in time. So what do we mean by that? Well, this is the one where maybe you see other people cutting back on working. Maybe they've been hit more directly by the negative shock. And by the way, all of this could be positive shocks as well, but it's just easier to talk about it with one type of shock. So we've had people maybe do intertemporal substitution. Things aren't going that great. I'm going to kind of pull back on working. I'm not getting that much for working, so I'm pulling back. Others who maybe were not hit directly by the aggregate demand shock will observe this pullback in work, and it can make sense for other sectors of the economy to start to work less as well. Many economic activities are kind of clustered in time because it makes sense to coordinate your economic actions with those of others. And if parts of the economy are slowing down, then your part of the economy might slow down as well. And so this time bunching will amplify shocks, both positive and negative, and it will transmit them not only through the economy, but essentially also through time as well. And that gets us to our fifth and final transmission and amplification item, and that will be collateral damage. That's an excellent name, don't you think? But what they mean by that is literally collateral, as you hear banks talk about it. They don't want to make a loan to you if you don't have collateral. So a collateral is a valuable asset that is promised to the lender, right? So if something goes wrong with the loan they made to you, they have access to your collateral. So the reason that can be a problem with a downturn is, what if the value of that asset fell when there's a negative shock, right? If the economy turned down and the loans are backed up by various pieces of collateral, who lose value because of the negative shock to the economy, then the collateral itself has been damaged. And that's what they call a collateral shock. So if times are good, asset values tend to be higher, cash flows are higher, so there's more loans made, businesses are growing, GDP is rising, and we're all having a great time. But during a recession, more borrowers start to look risky, fewer loans are being made. Often when the loan is most needed is when it's the hardest to get. There's more bankruptcies, there's slower businesses, lower employment, lower GDP. The banks are concerned about making loans at the time that, like I said, that you most need it, because the collateral that you're putting up is most likely damaged by the shock as well. So the collateral damage is our final idea that can, for the economy as a whole, amplify the booms and the busts. All right, so those are our 5 factors that will transmit positive and negative shocks through the economy and across time and can amplify and make them worse. And so since part of what we were trying to do in the last chapter by understanding the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is to have a model that models the business cycle, that we can understand why the economy has its ups and downs. And so then this chapter adds in a little bit more nuance about how the ups and downs can get so big and swing so much further than just the initial shock that happened.